thanks to Max and Philip for inviting me to speak. And I just realised that I think this might be the older version of my presentation that you have. But sorry, I did two of them on, the way you changed them, but I hope it's the right one. I'm going to speak about the subject. I should say, I suppose, who I am. I am very much an activist. I have been involved in a lot of politics at the national level, including many fights about the subject of care and justice, equality, and variety of shapes and forms. So my connection to this subject is not just academic, it's political, and I suppose it's personal. So what I'm going to talk about is the concept of affective relations, because when we did a study in 2000, we had a book on preparation, John Baker and I and others, called Equality from Theory to Action. And it was very strongly influenced, I suppose, of the politics of, obviously, distribution and redistribution, and the politics of recognition and representation. But when we went out, and this is like the dialogue that the people were talking about with the prisons, when we went out to community groups with our ideas about equality, they came back to us and they said, there's something missing. Where is the life that I lead? Where is my personal life, my relational life? And from that dialogue in 2000, we led to this notion of finding a concept which we called affective relations that would try and encompass the different dimensions of care, love and solidarity, which we distinguish between, and I'll explain in a moment, to try and deal with the world which was outside a particular form of politics. So I'm a sociologist by background, although I did study philosophy and economics as an undergraduate, and I've worked a lot of my life actually in the field of education research. So what I say today is based on a number of empirical studies. In affective equality is based on these studies of family caring, but also institutional caring, people who have been in institutional care, people who do care work as teachers and in education. And then we did another study, it's published in New Managerialism, which is really, I suppose, a study of the impact of neoliberalism on the institutional life of public sector organisations. And our theory in that is that new managerialism is the organisational form of neoliberalism and is profoundly careless and gendered. And then more recently, we've just done another study of working, learning and caring in higher education, which involved extensive interviews and site visits to 10 higher education institutions. And most recently, I'm involved in a European study of solidarity across Europe, including doing empirical research on that in Ireland, on the nature of solidarity. So that's where I come from, if you like, when I speak. I suppose what I say is not new to you here, because it's been said already today, so I'll go through it quickly. But our argument is that the affective domain of life, and I'm speaking, you must remember, as a sociologist for whom this is not a common language and certainly not a common subject, rising from dependencies and interdependencies. And I would argue that it's a distinct structural system of social relations in sociological terms. And that it produces us and reproduces us, not just reproduces us, because that's what a lot of feminist scholars have also said, it's the reproduction system. It isn't just reproduction, it is production, because it produces us in our humanness. And I suppose I'm also answering what I call the Marxist-Bavarian trilogy of class, status and power, that affective relations are not social derivatives. They're not subordinate to economic, political or cultural relations. They exist on a parallel sociological reality, even if we never speak about them, and they are the institutions and practices that have no name in political terms. So what I'm saying, therefore, they're sites of political import. And I must remember, I came to this understanding through an interest in social justice. So it's what would social justice mean? What would a just society mean? And as women are the default carers in society, paid and unpaid, affective justice is highly gendered. And of course, with migration and the use and abuse often of immigrants for poorly paid domestic and other care labour, it's also raced and it is classed. It was always classed. So I'm saying they are material. We are to produce somebody in their, not just their sociability, but in their kindnesses, in their compassion, in their gentleness. It is a material act, because it's produced in our bodies, in our hearts, in our minds. And of course, it is work that is both pleasurable and burdensome. I think that is, I feel very strongly, it isn't that this is all pleasure, it is burdensome work. And again, I would argue that it is a central structural role in sociological terms in relation to our relational life that economic relations have in our market life. And so silencing of affective relationships is, in politics, intellectually, is a way of silencing women and those with high dependency care needs and carers politically. Because, of course, we are all, as many people have said today, we are at different times, we are all interdependent and in need of care at different times of our life. And what I'm saying is, without recognizing the centrality of affective relations to the human condition, there's no way in which love, care and solidarity and women can be fully integrated into theories of justice within the social sciences. So what am I saying that, and this is probably, I would differ slightly from listening to Eva today, that primary care relations, I would argue, are love relations. They refer to our relations of high dependency, where there's greatest attachment, intimacy and responsibility over time. And love labouring is the work undertaken to create and maintain those relations. Published an article in Sociological Review. In fact, I've said this to other people, the first article on love labour in 1989 and in Sociological Review, and the editors changed the title because they told me the word love was inappropriate in an academic journal. That is true. It's called Solidarity Labour, Its Nature and Marginalisation. But by 2007, that changed. So there was an article published where I argued very strongly that love relations are chosen, sometimes friendship, partners, or they're bound, sometimes they arise from inherited or contractual dependencies and interdependencies, and there are primary care relations. But unlike care labour of the kind that involves in the secondary care sphere, love labouring is something that is inalienable and non-substitutable. You can't pretend go out to dinner with your somebody else and pretend that it is your partner. You can't pay somebody to hug your child and pretend it is yourself, or visit your mother in hospital. There is a non-substitutability, which I would argue is the essence of that primary care relationship. Secondary care relationships are equally important, but they are lower order in the sense that they involve care responsibilities and attachment, and I would accept what Eva Kathleen said earlier about this care disposition. It's very important in all of these. But they don't carry the same depth of moral obligation in terms of meeting dependency needs, especially long term. And as I've argued, the solidarity is, of course, in many respects, the political form of love, in its not calculative form. I've just published a paper with Manolis Kalzaki, one of my colleagues, on the difference between, in a European Journal of Social Theory, the difference between calculative and affective solidarity. Because solidarity can, of course, as somebody said this morning, I think that maybe it was Lynch, said, of course, solidarity can be inward-looking and can be exclusionary. So it's very important analytically to distinguish between the forms of solidarity which are exclusionary and those which are inclusionary. So how we have mapped those is in this way. And I'm saying in our sociological life, we exist in these realms, even if we are not aware of them and they don't appear to us in any visualized or even a political form. And how I would say is that these relations, if you like, are as sociological real as our economic relations, or our political relations, or our cultural relations. And what I would say that what feminists have given to me, and what I think is so important, is the critique of the ontological assumptions which are at the heart of the social sciences. And I would not say, and I wrote an article actually in 2007, it was on the importance of education for love, care and solidarity. That's one thing I feel very strongly about. People seem to think you can develop a concept of love and politics, etc., unless we have formal education which teaches us this. And one place I saw that very clearly, I visited Mondragon, and some of you will know it as the Centre for Cooperative Production, worker-owner production, a couple of years ago, and they made the point that if they are to educate the young people in the region, remember there are 89,000 people employed there in worker-owner cooperatives, that you have to educate the next generation on what it means to be cooperative. And I feel that that's a huge issue. We have no formal education. Most people can sail through education and never learn about love or care. But what I'm saying here is the concept of the person that we have at the heart of a lot of our social sciences is antithetical. Because Cartesian rationalism dictates what underpins formal education. Homo sapiens, not Homo sapiens sentiens, the person who knows through feeling. This autonomous view of the person as an ideal state reflected to me increasingly in how young children now get a cap and gown when they leave kindergarten. I mean, it's unbelievable. But that idea of you have now reached independence, you have somehow established yourself beyond the stage of vulnerability, and this rejection of the vulnerability of the embodied subject. And the person is assumed to be non-relational in decision making. On some other papers I've written, I've worked with a professor of palliative care in relation to care of people who obviously are very ill, not necessarily dying. And one of the issues that has come up a lot is how most people, even when they're dying, are very conscious of their relationality. They are very aware of who they are relating to and whether their illness or unwellness is going to impose on them. They do not always think just of themselves. And what I'm saying is a lot of our thinking assumes that social actions, certainly in the social sciences, are driven by self-referential interests, class status and power, rather than other self-interests. And of course, that the citizen who matters is the public adult citizen. We don't talk about children really as full citizens, nor do we talk about people who are actually at the end stage of life, independent, very ill. We assume that the citizen is this, ideally, homo economicus, because that's all the person that counts. Because as somebody said, this self-responsibilization thesis, which is very much part of the current political discourse, is bound up with this idea that you should be economically self-sufficient. But we are, as Trotter said in a recent article she published, homines curans. We are people who care. And we are not just homo economicus. So I'm saying these are fundamental assumptions. And why they matter? Because we're relational beings. And I'm not romanticizing love, care and solidarity, because that's one thing I've learned from our studies. It is far from romantic. In fact, it is often at one end stands love and care and solidarity, and the other land is abuse and violence. And actually, at the level of the state, of course, as many people have said here, we have institutionalized violence in prisons and other places. But I do want to emphasize that I think, certainly what I've learned from empirical research, that people see love, even when it's not a burden, they see it often as work. It's emotional work, physical work, mental work. It requires attentiveness, responsibility, commitments. And theories of justice that ignore that or ignore the effective relational life that we need to create people in their humanity. And I also think if you read Wilkinson Pickett new book, I'm sure you have read it, they talk a lot about how economic injustices create also mental illness, a fear of being unloved, unwanted, etc., creates poor health, creates anxiety. And the loneliness that Lynn spoke about this morning is such a profound problem in our society because no one has any time, because people are too busy being productive. And I'm just saying, therefore, women are central to this because they are central to these movements. They have challenged the separate conception of the person, the contractual models of which is a core premise of contractual models of social relations that inform dominant theories of justice, namely the autonomous self-interested persons. And I'm saying what I think feminist scholars and care theorists have done is they've taken the concept out of the privatized world of family where it's being consigned by most political theorists. And that, I suppose, is what I really wanted to critique, is that the social sciences, in my experience, ultimately assume we are utility maximizing individuals. And we are. There is no doubt about it, people are. But we're not governed exclusively by those interests. We're evaluative, and I think that that is something that is very important. People are moral agents. And one of the things that I've learned from the studies we've done, that people often make decisions which in very real career, and men and women, commercial terms, which are anti their interests. Not saying they're not self-interested, but they are normative people. And they evaluate actions normatively and in terms of interest. And, of course, human vulnerability lie at the base of that normativity. when you admit to your own vulnerability, you see the vulnerability of the other. But I don't think we are going to come to that state of knowingness without education. And how to do that education, I don't know. But I certainly know we won't get there unless we have it. That we will not understand the profound nature of our own vulnerability. And I suppose what I'm here, I'm just conscious of the time now. These are the four systems, and I'm thinking particularly of Nancy Fraser. I've written an article critiquing her concept of justice. In Hypatia, we called in 2017 with my colleague Sarah Cantillon, called Love Matters, Affective Equality, Love Matters. And I suppose in her three-dimensional theory of justice, she has identified the first three: representation, resource inequalities, recognition and representation. But we are arguing that there is a fourth dimension to justice, which is relational inequality. But these are all deeply integrated with one another. And that, I think, is very important. I would not see one as priority. And I know this is a very complex table to present, but it's in our book, our first book, on equality from theory to action. And this is a modified version of it here. And if you like, I have colour-coded where we would see the generative sites of injustice. The class system is generated, of course, in the economic system, but it affects all others. Because you don't have parity of representation in the exercise of power, because somebody hears your working class accent and they think you're not to be taken seriously. And when you go in somewhere, your clothes aren't right, so you don't have the same respect. And of course we know that economic injustice leads to and precipitates and enables violence in the household and in family and in affective relations. And I suppose what I'm saying is each one, we take, if you like, the idea that there are generative sites of injustice. And we're taking as the typical, if you like, site for children, for the quintessential example of people who are powerless, because they are often de facto, if not de jure, in the ownership of their parents. People who are intellectually disabled, people who are very ill, are often extremely powerless, but they are affected by all the other systems, and their status and their powerlessness interfaces with all the others. And so I'm saying as well that if you take the affective system, there are two dimensions to it. The lack of equality, which is well documented in the doing of love, care and solidarity work, particularly the first two, but also inequality and injustice in the receiving of care. Because I think that is a huge injustice in our time. People commuting 2 hours to work. We have, in the most recent study in the higher education institutions, people talk about the fact that they can't have children because they have no permanent job. They talk about the fact that they are not able to see their children until they are asleep because they are commuting so far to work. So they don't have time. And time is quintessentially vital in order to create human relationships. To be and to create that intimacy, you need to be present. That's what I talked about, the importance of the non-substitutability of that time. So I'm just saying, not saying that one is justice, because of course that status or lack of care feeds back into all the others. The emotional disturbance, the mental health, the lack of respect, etc. So what I'm saying, care is not just a mode of action, it's a disposition, and as was said already. And it encompasses everything how we relate to the environment. It's a way of relating ethically through attentiveness, responsiveness and informed other-centredness. And I think the neglect of it is a political issue, because most dominant theories of justice are about regulating relations between strangers. And in a sense, in the affective domain and or domains of life, we are not strangers in some senses to anybody, because we all live in the world environmentally and emotionally and politically in the larger world. We don't just live in our own isolated units. And I think in so doing, because we don't recognize that world, it's at the base of life. It's assumed to exist. And so many people, as some of us here today, if you have an elderly relative, a child, often we're free riders on other people's paid or poorly paid care labour. And I suppose what I was a bit surprised in a recent article by Nancy Fraser in New Left Review, she talks care issues not as justice issues but as boundary problems. I don't think they're boundary problems. They need to be framed in part of the theory of social change, because they're deeply woven with all the others, and inequalities in the latter or undermine capacities to do love, care and solidarity work. And the other thing, I suppose, people ask, why has it not entered the political domain? And of course it does, because the people who are most affected by this, the people who do primary care work, if I can just take that at the moment, the people who do care for the most vulnerable in society, particularly elderly people, people who are in hospital, people, there is an imminence and an urgency about that, so that people can't be left. And those people, both those who are in those positions and the people who do that work, are excluded from political activism. So they can't frame the politics of society, because the imminence and urgency often of that work, the way it is structured in our society, especially because it relies on so much unpaid female labour, they can't enter the political domain. And I think that's a serious, serious question politically. That neither do the high care dependent physically and mentally can bring their issues to the public domain. So that is, I suppose, I know I'm hurrying and say this very quickly, but that's what I wanted to say is, I suppose, that I think this is a system. I don't think it's and also ran. I think unless we recognise the centrality of these institutions in terms of creating political solidarity at the nation state and beyond, secondary care, in our health care, in our education, our welfare, and in our friendships and primary care relations, we need to create a broader, if you like, formation and political formation to enable those things to happen. Thank you very much. Oh yeah, sure.
So, thank you. We have time for one or two questions. Do you have any questions?
That was so interesting, Kathleen. I wonder if you could just say a little more about your disagreements with Nancy Fraser, because she's so often quoted now as the key figure for those who want to talk about care in our time. And I will definitely read the article, but I wondered if you could just say a little more.
Well, I think if you read her what's the book in 2008? In that book, she claims that there are three major conditions, which is, if you like, the politics of redistribution, the politics of recognition, and the politics of representation. But the quintessential point of Nancy Fraser's theory is that you need parity of representation in political terms in the exercise of power if you are to be, if you like, it's like Arendt talk, the right to have rights. If you are to be seen politically, if you are to be known politically. And the point that I make in an article I published in a book called, I think it's Feminist and Love, Anna Ferguson and Jonas' daughter published it in 2014. In the critique of Fraser, I'm making the point that you cannot talk about love and care as if they were peripheral to this. Because the people who do most of this work are not able to have parity of representation because they are doing work that is urgent, imminent, and not substitutable. So I don't know what the solution is for politics, but I mean, that is why I think, and thinking of what you said this morning about the rise of the right saw in the conservative language that the family mattered. We don't like that language. People on the left and feminists, they don't like it because they think, so they're going to go back there to those institutions and consign us all to serfdom. But the truth is that people do care about their relationships, and they want institutions that enable them, and I think that is a huge omission. But in theories of justice, I have to say, they are hugely male-dominated, and they don't take it seriously. I mean, I had references in there, but I took it out. In Negri and Hart's book, The Multitude. That book talks about love. It never mentions, maybe there's something wrong with me, but people don't respect other people. They don't quote all the women and feminists who have written extensively about love, Fronto and Toni Morrison and all those people, Bell Hooks, all of whom have written extensively about love. But they talk about the mobilisation of the commons through the WTO, Seattle, etc. But where is the mobilisation of all those people who are silently left to care with no resources? How are we going to mobilise them politically? Now, I think that is an enormous challenge. I don't know what the solution is, but I think it is the challenge, because as people endure with minding their elderly, seriously intellectually disabled children at home, they say, I am tired of this. No one is listening. No one is listening to my loneliness. Just to give you an example, I was in the west of Ireland, County Mayo actually, Charlestown. I was invited to give a lecture on affective equality, yes, in 2012. The hall was full. And it was full because I subtitled to it about affective equality and the injustice of emigration. Because when you force people to emigrate, you deprive the people who were left behind of the people they know. They have no one. They have no relationships. They've no one to have a cup of tea. They've no one to call in. They have no one. And life is, for most people, okay, we have our ambitions, but at the end of the day, most people want to have neighbours, they want the people they know, and they want to get to know people. And if we create institutions that doesn't enable people to have time to care, I think we are completely disrespecting the human condition. And that's why I think there is a problem with that theory of justice, because the very principle which Fraser herself has put into our theory, which is parity of representation in the exercise of power, people who are carers and people who are highly dependent do not have it. So where do they exist in your theory of justice?
I think actually in the more recent things she's written about care, she perhaps would agree a little more with you about the problems of time and our existing state of capitalism simply does not allow.
Yeah, I think so, maybe in 2016, but I mean, at the same time, it's not integrated. What I'm pointing out is it's not integrated into the theory of care. Relational justice, it's 4 R's as I call them: redistribution / distribution, recognition, representation and relationality are 4 anchors of justice. And we can't just treat relationality as an after ran.
Hi, thank you for coming down. In your slide,
Which one?
it spoke about the redistribution of
This one?
working class economic system. Right, so how would you see that? Because for me, institutions of, I would call them, are steroid, capitalism on steroids. So how would you see that redistribution in terms of policy making, where policies can be easily manipulated for capitalistic tools and agendas for maybe causing a type of coercion on a different type of person, say someone who's got disabilities, for example?
Sorry?
I'm just saying, how would you see the redistribution of...
Well, I'm just saying that this is the generative side of injustice. It's a capitalist society. It's built on injustice. I mean, the Congress of Trade Unions in Ireland asked me to give a talk one day on equality, and the first thing I started with was the concept of the differentials, which is institutionalised in most trade union negotiations. It's built into the system. And that's when people talk about Keynesian economics and why people maybe underline to it, but people forget that built into it was a stratification, the institutionalisation of the stratification of the class system. It was an accommodation. It wasn't a win. And maybe there couldn't be a win, and we're far even now, we've gone back the other way. But all I'm saying is this is the site of where economic injustice, and absolutely, I've written a lot about neoliberal capitalism. The subtitle of that article, Affective Equality and Effective and Calculative Justice, is the influence of individualism, which I would talk about another day, which I think is far more profound in Europe than we admit, and neoliberal capitalism, because it's very strong. So all I'm saying here is there are generative sites of injustice. Colour is a huge site of injustice. Being black, I put that black in Ireland because I know the Professor of Black Studies is going to be speaking after me, and I'm absolutely delighted, look forward to hearing, because at the behest, and this is what I call about resistance from within, I got the university to agree to start a Black Studies and Critical Race Theory program this year in the School of Education. We have travelled 3 years ago, and it will be taught by people who are mostly black, because the whole principle is that this area is not going to be colonised by white people. And with travellers who are nomadic people in Ireland, 4 years ago, I worked with 2 traveller organisations, 2 PhD students who are travellers, to get them to come in to teach to the university, to resist, to create resistance within. But that's institutionalising resistance. And I think you have to do that. So sorry, but that's all I'm saying there. That's all I'm saying about that.
Okay, I just thought you
Yeah,
said.
no, I'm not saying, I don't have, if we could overthrow capitalism, I'm sure there would be other differentiations and those other ones would not go away. That's what I'm saying.
Yeah.